topic this week is the ego, friend or foe? Well, we all know the answer is the ego is both our enemy and our friend. Yogis say that for the soul to evolve, it must develop the ego before it can transcend it. We need to have some life experience before we have the desire to change. In the Mahabharata, Bhishma represents the ego, and Bhishma can choose the hour of his death. And likewise, the ego must surrender itself when it's ready and when we choose. The ego is the enemy in that it can keep us bound to suffering and the little self. And it's our friend because when we offer it up into the light, then we become free. Swami Kriyananda said, the first duty of every soul is to release the hold of ego consciousness, to release the hold that ego consciousness has upon it. Ego transcendence is the first and the only challenge on the spiritual path. And what brings that ego to the point of surrender is not what we do as much as our attitude. And this is illustrated in one place is a beautiful discourse by Jesus. And the following we can say are the attitudes for our spiritual growth. That's what we're looking at today. And he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed those who thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers. They shall be called the children of God." Poor in spirit, as is written here, means to be without ego, without selfish motives, receptive to God's will. And by their non-attachment, such people already live in heavenly bliss. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, the humble, the harmonious, in harmony with nature and divine law, and in attunement with God." Swami Kriyananda said, "Blessed are the merciful, who are more concerned for others than for themselves. Blessed are they who serve consciously as instruments of divine grace, for in their very giving they shall receive." The merciful, as Yogananda Ji said, we need to win the love of another human before we can win the love of God. We need to express that mercy and that love. And then blessed are the peacemakers, those who live in the consciousness of inner peace. Peacemaking is a constant, conscious emanation of inner peace toward the world. To be poor in spirit means to see oneself as owning nothing. Everything belongs to God, a manifestation of that divine consciousness. One disciple of Baduri Mahashaya, the levitating saint that we read about in Autobiography of a Yogi, he praises Baduri for renouncing great family wealth to enter the spiritual path. And Baduri responds, and he says, "You are reversing the case. I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures, for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? The short-sighted worldly folk are the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys." Now, just who are these short-sighted worldly folk? Does that mean that's all the householders? Is that us? And once I visited the river where Shankaracharya, when he was 8 years old, he was caught by a crocodile, and he gave his mother the ultimatum: if you don't let me leave home and become a sannyasin, I will allow the crocodile to eat me. And we all know the stories of the saints who left their family duties and practiced years of severe tapasya. And this is the image that we have of what a yogi is. And in medieval Europe, one could either live a very worldly life or choose to live behind the walls of a cloistered monastery. There was no in-between. In the US, there were two men who were self-made multimillionaires, and they very much lived in the world. But these same two men were also the most advanced, spiritually advanced disciples of Yogananda ji, because they had applied tremendous energy to making money, and then they directed that same energy towards perfecting spiritual attitudes. And this is a whole new approach to yoga, isn't it? When Babaji gave Kriya Yoga to Lahiri Mahashaya, he told them to give Kriya freely to all who humbly ask for help, all those householders. And so we enter the age of the modern householder yogi. In the Autobiography, Yogananda ji compares the path of outer renunciation of the monk with that of the householder yogi. And he makes a very bold statement there. He writes, "To fulfill one's earthly responsibilities is indeed the higher path, provided the yogi, maintaining a mental uninvolvement with egotistical desires, plays his part as a willing instrument of God." And so it all comes down to attitude. He says there's no need to renounce the world if we can inwardly renounce egotistical desires. Our outer duties and challenges may even provide us with valuable lessons that perhaps we would not have received if we lived alone in a cave or in a sattvic ashram. And how can we refine our attitudes more? I first learned transcendental meditation. And my neophyte friends would say, look here, it's written in the book. If we just practice meditation 20 minutes twice a day, and if we practice for 8 years, we will be self-realized. We really counted on what was written in the book. We really counted on that. But I just didn't realize that practicing a technique in some mechanical way would change my consciousness. That I didn't know that spiritual growth came from understanding my own nature. That came from changing some of my own attitudes or applying the teachings in my daily life. And when we can calmly accept our tests as coming for our own growth, and when we can offer the selfish desires of the ego up to the divine, then what we receive is that divine strength and guidance to meet every challenge. Thank you.
This title, Ego, Friend or Foe. Unfortunately, the ego does take a bashing on the path to on the path of self-realization. Ego really is always having the battle with the soul. We always want the soul to win. We want the ego to lose. Sort of within our classes and within our satsangs, usually the ego really gets a bad name. But we need the ego. We, as Keshava, we never compare our notes, so if we overlap a little bit, as Keshava said, we need to have some sort of sense of who we are. We can't go through life thinking I can't go through life thinking I'm the Queen of England, because if I did, everybody would think, well, she's nuts. So we have to have this sense, even from a young age, okay? This is my family, this is where I live, this is my address, this is who I am. So that gets us started. And often that's just where the ego wants to rest. And, we need to, let's say, Yogananda's definition of the ego is the soul attached to the body. Because the soul's nature is infinite and eternal, and yet the ego only identifies with this body in this material world. And as we all know from the yogic teachings, the soul descends through consciousness, through a body of energy and light, before it actually takes this body of physical form. And so the ego really only thinks it is a very, very, very small part of its true nature. It has no idea and is not aware of its true nature. It pretty much says, this is who I am in this limited form. So what can we do to coax that ego into helping us on our path to self-realization? Instead of just trying to hammer it out of us all the time, let's befriend it. So let's be friends with the ego. So we can just carry it along. And so we say to the ego, like we would say for a little child. I think Devi has given this, Swami Devi has given this story before, that when her son came home from school and there was an argument between boys, and they needed to apologize to each other, and she said, don't you want to be a big boy and apologize and, try to have harmony with your friend? Don't you want to be a grown-up? He goes, no, I don't want to grow up. I don't want to be a grown-up. And I think that's often the ego's point of view. I just don't want to grow up. I want to stay exactly the way I am. And so, Yogananda uses the image of a cage, and the cage has bars all around it, and the bird has grown up in the cage, perfectly happy in the cage, so that when you open the door of the cage, you think the bird's just going to want to fly into freedom, and yet he's so comfortable in the cage, doesn't want to leave. Also the story of Yogananda ji and his friend when they try to fly to the Himalayas, and they're stopped at the train station, I think in Varanasi, can't remember where exactly, maybe Hardwar. And somebody knows Hardwar. And his friend's family is there waiting. His friend's brother is there waiting. And Yogananda said, I wish I could remember his name. You guys, anyway, he said that the friend was basking in familiar warmth. Because often what we know, this cage, familiar warmth, is more secure than, makes us feel better than what if I fly into the unknown? What will be my strength? Where will my security come from? Where will my happiness come from if I try to take this risk? And so we think of people who egos that can only relate to their own reality, such as this little boy. I don't want to grow up. Because sort of the sign of an unhealthy mind is not being able to relate to anybody's realities but their own. And a child is often like that. He only cares about what he cares about. He's too young to understand what the bigger picture is. But, for example, in Japan, I read that, if you're mentally ill and the only thing you can relate to is your own reality, one of the things they start to do is introduce a guppy. He introduce a goldfish in a bowl. And so that this person needs to start feeding the fish and keeping the fish alive. And if he can keep the fish alive, then it moves on to a plant. Then this man has to keep taking care of a plant, and then a kitten, and then a garden. And so slowly, this mentally ill patient begins to start relating to others' realities and starting to serve. So it's sort of like us when we are growing up, or when we're slowly becoming mature and we're adults and we're out working in the world, and we're saying, whatever I receive is mine for myself and I'm not going to share it with anybody else. That's sort of another aspect of that same man that can't see beyond his own reality. And so part of the ego's growing up is saying, I want to use some of my resources, some of my energy, some of my time to share with others and to expand my awareness just in that giving and sharing of energy. So let's say, I'm a good example. I grew up very worldly. I had a worldly job. I was making lots of money. And, for a time, I just spent all that money and used it all for myself. I bought lots of clothes. I went on lots of trips. And then I wandered in. But at some point, I was saying, isn't there something more? Because after fulfilling all those desires, it's like, now what? Neti. I've taken these trips. I've done this. I've done that. So what's next? I'm still not feeling fulfilled. So this is what the ego comes to, finally, after becoming an adult, perhaps, and living a very mature life that everybody thinks is what we all are supposed to do. There is a sense of emptiness. What is it all for? What is the purpose of my life? Why was I born? And so then we might start to, also realize that sometimes I'm happy and sometimes I'm depressed. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. I'm just entrenched in this world of Maya, and all my concentration and thoughts and energy is going to what I want, what I don't want, what I desire, what I fear. And so my energy is so caught up in Maya that I can't really progress and move forward to the fulfillment of my life, the purpose of my life. And so finally, when we get to that point where we are suffering, because the ego, as Keshava said, we will continue to suffer as long as we are just in Maya's clasp. And so at some point we think, I'll take a meditation class. I'll read a scripture. I'll try to find out what I can do next. And soon as we start meditating, soon as we start bringing that energy inside and drawing it upwards and no longer so possessed by duality, by Maya, by our desires, by our attachments, suddenly we start to have a higher awareness. For the first time, I'm experiencing peace. For the first time, I'm experiencing a joy from the inside that continues. It's not based on something outside myself. And so then the ego actually starts to realize, even I'm happier like this. I didn't like, suffering every other day. One day I'm up, one day I'm down. So that the ego says, maybe there is something to this meditation. And so our higher awareness starts to motivate our behavior and our activities. And the ego starts to get on board. We've been carrying the ego along, and now the ego's getting on board. And so now we're just realizing that even by serving others and by giving to others, I can still be who I am, because the ego's fear is that I can't be me. I can't be separate. I can't exist. Everybody's talking about merging in the infinite, but what about me? The spiritual path is like, yes, you should go merge into the infinite. It's like, I don't want to merge into the infinite. I want to live my life. I want to have fun. But suddenly the ego is starting to be attuned to a higher awareness, to a grander vision. And suddenly the activities of perhaps an environment of peaceful spiritual people seems appealing. Wouldn't have before, but now suddenly it seems appealing. Seems appealing to give some of my energy and my resources and my time to something higher than just my little self. And boy, that feels good when I do that. And then I start to realize that my commitment and my priority to just taking care of myself is changing into something else. And now my priority is to actually feel this peace and this bliss more often. This bliss of my true nature, of my soul nature that I'm starting to feel, is becoming more appealing than the ups and downs of my ego. So slowly the soul is winning the ego over. And instead of saying, okay, I have to develop my talents because I have to fulfill my destiny, which is what the ego would say, now the ego combined with the soul is saying, how can I be an instrument for light in this world? And how, not what do I want, what do I desire, but what does this higher power that now I'm tuning into, what does that want of me? And suddenly I'm no longer the one doing it, but there's a higher power flowing through me and acting in all these activities. So it's not like a passive surrender, a killing, a dying off of the ego. It's more like an active participation with the higher power that's flowing through me. And so then the soul gets brought along. And, the masters tell us that the seat of the ego is in the medulla oblongata, and the seat of the soul, or the doorway to infinite consciousness, is the spiritual eye. They're actually very close to each other. And so Swami and Yoganandaji says, from the point of the ego, project yourself to the spiritual eye and through the spiritual eye. So our little ego self, that little ego self that didn't want to grow up, suddenly now is saying, from this point, lifting its arms, Divine Mother, Divine Light, I offer myself to you. Lift me up. Here I am. Lift me up. And then slowly, slowly, this is how the ego becomes transcended into our true soul nature. So we have seen again and again at Ananda on the spiritual path, souls that just taking that first step to meditation. And even meditation is a soul-ego argument, especially when we're starting. The ego does not want to meditate. The soul wants to meditate. And so even waking up early to have a meditation practice becomes almost a morning by morning struggle. The alarm goes off at early because I want to have time to meditate. And the ego says, no, I want to sleep. And the soul says, yes, we have to get up and meditate. So they have this struggle. And I mean, even people after a year sometime of taking classes and coming almost every Sunday, they cannot get a habit going because their ego is like saying no. And so this is why we need to be gentle but firm. The soul has to say, don't we feel better when we meditate? Aren't we happier overall when we meditate? Don't we suffer much less when we can go inside and attune ourselves to God, to the Guru? And then also when I give my energy to a greater cause, don't we feel better? Don't we feel expanded? Don't we, when we love God, when we feel love from God, doesn't it open our hearts? And so we have to have this dialogue sometime. And maybe we have to throw the ego a bone once in a while. Yes, we can stay up late and watch this movie. Yes, we can do this. But tomorrow morning we're going to get up and meditate. So it's sometimes just a negotiation. But the spiritual fair is coming up in 3 weeks. And one of the things that we've seen so often is that devotees that think of the joy they can give to others in sharing light, in being instruments of light, being instruments of joy. It's like coming together, serving in harmony, loving God together, being an environment of joy. That's what brings the ego along, because the ego knows happiness when it feels it. So more and more, we don't surrender crying to God, to the Guru, to Divine Mother. We offer ourselves with love, willingness, from the spiritual eye, from the medulla to the spiritual eye. And I'll end with the story of the salt doll, which you probably know. The doll made of salt that crosses many, many lands and finally gets to the sea and sees the sea and says, "What is this?" Says to the sea, "Who are you? What is this? I've never seen anything like it." He said, "Oh, you'll have to come and see." So the salt doll starts to walk towards the sea, puts his toe in, puts her toe in, puts her leg in, and dissolves. And she said, "Oh, what is this?" So she keeps walking. He says, "No, come in, you'll have to see." So she keeps going in, and of course, when she goes into the sea, she dissolves. And at the end, she said, "Oh, this is who I